Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Patagonian winds have a way of making you question reality. As a meteorologist studying extreme weather patterns, I'd seen my share of strange phenomena, but nothing prepared me for what we encountered in that remote corner of Argentina. My partner Miguel and I had been tracking an unusual storm system that defied all known weather models. The local gauchos had warned us about venturing into the mountains during storm season. There are things in the wind that hunger. The oldest of them had said in rapid Spanish, his eyes never leaving the distant peaks, things that wear the storm like a coat. We dismissed it as superstition, focused instead on our scientific instruments and weather radar. Our research station was the last outpost before the wilderness took over completely. A small cluster of buildings dwarfed by towering peaks and endless sky. The storms here were different. They moved against prevailing winds, formed patterns that shouldn't be possible, and sometimes seemed to follow travelers through the mountains. We first noticed him during a particularly violent storm. A tall figure in pristine white weather gear, carrying what looked like meteorological equipment. He stood motionless on a ridge, seemingly untouched by the gale force winds that threatened to tear our station apart. Through our weather-beaten window, I watched him raise something that looked like an antiquated atmospheric measuring device. The stranger appeared at our door just as our instruments began registering impossible readings. He introduced himself as Dr. Vega, speaking perfect English with an accent I couldn't place. Something about his movements felt wrong, too precise, as if he'd learned human behavior from a manual. He carried what looked like old-fashioned weather measuring equipment, including what he claimed was a specialized barometer in a glass cylinder. But when he held it up to demonstrate, the liquid inside moved in ways that violated physics, flowing upward against gravity. The storms here are unique, he said, his voice carrying an odd resonance that made my teeth ache. They contain patterns within patterns, frequencies that call to certain researchers. His smile never reached his eyes, which seemed to reflect swirling clouds despite the fluorescent lighting of our station. Miguel tried to take a photo of Dr. Vega's unusual equipment, but every shot came out distorted, showing only swirling mists where the man should have been. When I asked about his research institute, his answer was vague, yet somehow threatening. We've been studying these storms since before there were words for what we do. The stranger's presence coincided with our equipment malfunction. Satellite feeds showed impossible readings. and our weather radar displayed patterns that looked almost like writing. Through the static of our radio, we caught fragments of what sounded like ancient Spanish mixed with something older, something that made the listeners' ears bleed. As the storm intensified, Dr. Vega became more animated. He moved around our station with increasing speed, his movements becoming less human with each passing moment. The liquid in his glass cylinder began to glow, casting shadows that didn't match any light source. When he approached me with his measuring device, I finally understood what the gauchos had meant. Through the glass, I didn't see my reflection. I saw something ancient and vast, something that wore the storm like we wear clothes. The liquid inside wasn't measuring atmospheric pressure. It was sampling something far more fundamental. Miguel saw it too. We backed away as Dr. Vega's form began to blur at the edges, his pristine white gear rippling like cloud formations. "Your kind has advanced," he said, his voice now containing the howl of the wind. "You see patterns we once hid easily. This requires adjustment." He raised the cylinder, and reality seemed to bend around it. Our monitors exploded in cascades of sparks, and every piece of modern equipment in the station died simultaneously. Through the windows, we watched the storm form impossible shapes, creating geometries that hurt to look at. We ran. There was nothing else to do. As we fled through the howling wind, I glanced back to see Dr. Vega's form dissolve into the storm itself, becoming one with the swirling patterns we'd been studying. His last words carried on the wind. "Some phenomena are not meant to be measured, only experienced." The rangers found us miles away, huddled in a shepherd's hut. Our research station was intact, but every piece of electronic equipment had been transformed into antique mechanical weather instruments, each one showing readings in number systems that didn't exist. The old gaucho wasn't surprised by our story. "The storm spirits have worn many faces," he said, warming us with mate tea. "Sometimes they wear the faces of those who study them, testing how close we've come to understanding their true nature." I still study weather patterns, but now from the safety of my university office. Sometimes, during unusual storms, I catch glimpses of a familiar figure in weather satellite footage, a man in white, carrying antiquated equipment, appearing wherever weather patterns defy explanation. I've learned to shut down my monitors when I see him. Some types of research, I've discovered, attract the attention of things that prefer to remain unstudied. The Siberian taiga stretches endlessly in all directions, a frozen labyrinth of ancient pines and snow-laden birch trees. I'd spent months photographing wildlife along the Lena River, but nothing in my 20 years with National Geographic had prepared me for that night. The The locals in the last Yakut village had warned me about the spirit tiger that prowled these woods during the first snows, but like many outsiders, I dismissed their concerns as folklore. My guide, Victor, and I had established our camp on a natural ridge overlooking the river. The first snow of winter had fallen that morning, transforming the landscape into a pristine white canvas marked only by animal tracks. We were tracking an unusually large male Amur tiger that local hunters claimed was unlike any other they'd encountered. The old Yakut hunter who'd shared his knowledge with us had been specific in his warning. This one is not like others. He knows when you seek him, and sometimes he seeks you back. Victor had crossed himself at these words, though he tried to hide it from me. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to answer nature's call. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and my breath formed crystalline clouds in the moonlight. Victor was asleep in his tent, his soft snoring barely audible over the gentle rushing of the river below. The silence struck me first, that absolute stillness that happens in deep winter when snow blankets everything. No wind in the trees, no nocturnal animals, not even the sound of ice cracking on the river. Just complete, absolute silence that made every crunch of snow under my boots sound like an explosion. That's when I heard it, the deliberate snap of a frozen branch. My blood turned to ice as I slowly turned toward the sound. There, not 20 feet away, stood the largest Amur tiger I'd ever seen. In the moonlight, its coat wasn't the usual orange, but an ethereal silver white, almost glowing against the darkness of the forest. Time seemed to stop as we locked eyes. These cats are massive, the largest of all tigers, but this one was extraordinary. Its shoulders stood as high as my chest, and its head was larger than my torso. But it was the eyes that held me. Not the usual amber of a tiger, but an impossible pale blue that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The tiger moved with impossible silence through the deep snow, each step deliberate and weightless. My mind screamed to run, but my body understood the futility of that action. I'd photographed big cats across the world, lions in Africa, jaguars in Brazil. But this felt different. This wasn't just a predator evaluating prey. This was something else entirely. It circled me with fluid grace, its massive head level with its shoulders, those ethereal eyes never leaving mine. Through my terror, I noticed something strange. It cast no shadow in the moonlight, and its paws left no prints in the fresh snow. The beast stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I should have felt its breath in the frozen air. But there was nothing, no warmth, no breath, no sound of a living creature. It opened its mouth in what should have been a roar, but instead, I heard what sounded like ancient Yakut words carried on the wind. My legs finally gave out, and I fell backward into the snow. The tiger leaned forward, its massive face inches from mine. In that moment, I saw something in those eyes, not just intelligence, but eons of knowledge, as if I were facing something that had walked these forests since the first snows fell on Earth. It spoke again, the words forming in my mind rather than my ears. You came to capture my image, but some things cannot be caught by your machines. Then, it simply faded away like morning mist, leaving no trace in the pristine snow. I scrambled back to camp, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Victor was already awake, his face pale in the moonlight. He'd heard nothing, but the tea in his cup had frozen solid in seconds, something he'd never seen happen before. At dawn, we found all our camera traps triggered, but the memory cards were blank except for a single image. A perfect print of a massive tiger paw in the snow, larger than any on record, with ancient Yakut symbols written around it in frost. The old hunter wasn't surprised by our story. You met the guardian, he said matter-of-factly, the one who decides what may be seen and what must remain hidden. He showed us a centuries-old parchment with a drawing of a white tiger with blue eyes, identical to what we'd seen. I still photograph wildlife, but I've never returned to that part of Siberia. Sometimes, when I'm reviewing photos from anywhere in the world, I catch a glimpse of pale blue eyes in the background, watching through the trees. I've learned to delete those photos immediately. Some beings I've discovered transcend mere physical boundaries, and their images are not meant to be captured by mortal devices. The Yakut people still tell stories of the spirit tiger, the guardian of the frozen forests. They say it appears to those who venture too deep into the taiga's mysteries, a reminder that some wonders are meant to be encountered, not documented. Every winter, when the first snow falls, they leave offerings by the forest's edge, not to appease the great cat, but to thank it for guarding the boundaries between the known and the unknowable. The ancient forests of the Carpathians hold their secrets close, especially on the eve of St. Andrew's Day, when the boundary between worlds grows thin. As a photographer specializing in historical architecture, I traveled across Eastern Europe documenting wooden churches. But something about these mountains felt different. My German shepherd, Max, had been unusually alert since we'd entered this valley, his ears constantly moving, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. My trusty Lada Niva, borrowed from a local contact, had carried us deep into the mountains, where these centuries-old churches stood like forgotten sentinels among the trees. The elderly priest at the last village had been reluctant to tell me how to find the oldest church, crossing himself repeatedly before finally drawing me a crude map. Some places, he'd said in halting German, remember too much. They remember things that should stay forgotten. I'd smiled politely, used to local superstitions after years of photographing religious sites. But Max had whined softly at the priest's words, pressing against my leg. The sun was setting when we found the church, its weathered spire rising from a clearing like a dark finger against the purple sky. The wood was blackened with age, the crosses atop its domes tilting at odd angles. No path led to its door. Nature had reclaimed whatever trail once existed, leaving only whispers in the underbrush. I parked the Neva at the edge of the clearing, planning to camp there overnight and photograph the church at dawn when the light would be perfect. Max helped me set up our tent, though he kept looking toward the church, his hackles slightly raised. I'd never seen him so unsettled. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The normal nighttime sounds: owls, wind in the trees, small animals, faded into an unnatural silence. Even the air felt different, thicker somehow, as if it were being compressed by something vast and unseen. Max refused to leave my side, pressing close against me as I prepared our evening meal. The first strange occurrence was the bells. The church had no bells. I'd noted their absence in my preliminary photos. Yet clear, deep tolling emerged from the structure, though nothing visibly moved. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating in my bones rather than my ears. Max began to growl, not his usual warning bark, but a low, continuous sound I'd never heard him make before. Through my camera's viewfinder, I saw something impossible lights moving inside the church, though its windows were solid wood, sealed by centuries of neglect. Then came the singing, ancient hymns in a language I didn't recognize drifted through the clearing, carried on air that had grown preternaturally still. The voices seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, rising up through the roots of the ancient trees that surrounded us. I watched, transfixed, as shadows moved across the church walls, not cast by any visible source, but flowing like water over the aged wood. They formed patterns that seemed to contain meanings just beyond my comprehension. Symbols that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. Max's growl turned to a whimper. He backed into our tent, something he'd never done before. He was a trained protection dog, bred for courage. I followed him, my heart pounding as the singing grew louder, closer. Through the tent's thin walls, I saw figures moving through the clearing, tall, oddly proportioned shapes that seemed to float rather than walk. They moved toward the church in a procession, carrying lights that cast no illumination on the ground beneath them. Their features, when I caught glimpses of them, seemed to shift and change, as if unable to settle on a single form. I heard them speaking, not in Romanian or any modern language, but something older, something that made the air vibrate and Max cover his ears with his paws. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual, circling the church in patterns that made my head spin. when I tried to follow them. Then one of them stopped, turning toward our tent. The singing ceased abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps approaching. Not the sound of feet on grass, but something else. Something that made the ground resonate like a drum. A shadow fell across our tent, impossibly tall and strangely angular. A voice spoke, ancient and deep. You come to capture our gathering with your machines. Some meetings are not meant for mortal eyes. The words weren't in any language I knew, yet I understood them perfectly. Max, my brave, protective dog, pressed himself against me, trembling. The shadow reached toward our tent, and where its fingers touched, the fabric seemed to become transparent, showing visions of other times, the church when it was new, processions of long-dead priests, rituals performed by people wearing clothes from centuries past. When I woke, it was dawn. Our tent had somehow moved, now sitting at the edge of the forest rather than in the clearing. Every photograph I'd taken was gone from my camera, replaced with a single image. The church as it had appeared hundreds of years ago, surrounded by figures in ancient religious garb, their faces deliberately blurred. The old priest wasn't surprised when I showed him the photo. They gather still, he said quietly. The first priests, the old believers, they guard their traditions, their mysteries. Be grateful they only took your pictures. He then showed me century-old church records describing identical encounters. Photographers and artists who came to capture the church, only to be left with strange visions and missing works. I still photograph religious architecture, but I never stay near old churches after dark. Sometimes, when I'm developing photos of any ancient religious site, I catch glimpses of those tall, strange figures in the background, still performing their eternal rituals. I've learned to delete those images immediately. Some ceremonies, after all, are meant to remain unrecorded, preserved only in the memories of those who were never meant to witness them. I'm hesitant to share this story, but after years of guiding tourists through various mountain trails, I feel compelled to tell what happened that night in the Carpathian Mountains. My name is Michael, and I've spent most of my life exploring the wilderness. I'm not someone who easily gets spooked, nor do I tend to exaggerate my experiences. It was early June, and I was eager to test my new tent. I called my friend Andrew, and we planned a camping trip. We considered several popular spots, but decided to venture deeper into the mountains, away from the tourist trails. We chose a remote location I knew well, a small plateau nestled between ancient beech forests. The hike was challenging, descending through dense forest where centuries-old trees created a natural canopy above us. The air was thick with the scent of wild herbs and mushrooms. By late afternoon, we reached a perfect camping spot near a small mountain stream. Its crystal clear water creating a soothing ambient sound. As dusk approached, we gathered firewood and set up camp. The weather was perfect, with a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. We sat around the fire, sharing stories and enjoying the solitude. Being longtime fans of cryptozoology shows, we jokingly decided to try some of their techniques, more for entertainment than anything else. We started with tree knocking, a simple technique where you strike a tree with a stick, creating a loud echoing sound through the forest. At first, it was just fun and games. We'd knock and wait, listening to the evening sounds of the forest. But then something changed. From somewhere deep in the darkness, we heard a clear response, 3 distinct knocks. Andrew and I exchanged glances before we could process what happened. Another series of knocks echoed from a different direction. Then another. The sounds seemed to be coming from multiple locations, forming a perimeter around our camp. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away. Maybe woodpeckers, maybe branches falling. But as we listened, the sounds became more deliberate, more coordinated. It was as if whatever was out there was communicating, passing messages around us in some kind of primitive code. Against my better judgment, we decided to escalate our experiment. We started making whooping calls into the darkness. The forest fell silent for a moment, and then something responded. The sound that came back wasn't human, wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered in these mountains. It was deep, primal, and sent chills down my spine. As the night wore on, the activity intensified. We could hear movement in the forest, heavy footsteps circling our camp. Just beyond the firelight, sometimes branches would crack. Other times, we'd hear what sounded like something being thrown. Around 2 in the morning, the fire started dying. Andrew ran out of wood, and the darkness crept closer. The sounds grew bolder, closer. Then it happened. Something large crashed through the underbrush, running straight toward our camp. The sound grew louder, until I felt the ground vibrate under my tent. Suddenly, there was pressure on my tent's tarp. Something was standing right there. I lay frozen, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Then came the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. 3 powerful, deliberate huffs, like a massive creature breathing directly above my tent. The sound wasn't at ground level. It was coming from height well above where any normal animal would be. Without warning, the creature turned and crashed back into the forest. We grabbed our essential gear and fled, leaving most of our equipment behind. The next morning, when we returned to collect our things, we found large, inexplicable footprints around the camp. Years have passed, but I still can't explain what happened that night. The mountains hold their secrets well. Sometimes, when I'm guiding tour through those forests, I catch myself listening for those distinctive knocks, wondering what really lurks in the ancient woods of the Carpathians. used to take my kids to this peculiar swimming pool at an old sports complex just outside the city. The pool itself was surprisingly well maintained, a stark contrast to the abandoned Soviet-era buildings surrounding it. Crystal clear water gleamed in an Olympic-sized concrete basin, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to watch over the facility like ancient guardians. The complex was built in the 1970s as a prestigious sports training center, but most of it had fallen into disrepair after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Only the pool remained operational, maintained by a small staff who seemed as mysterious as the place itself. Marina, the lifeguard, caught my attention one particularly hot afternoon when boredom got the better of me. She couldn't have been more than 25, with a stern face that suggested she'd seen more than her years would indicate. I had nothing to read that day, and watching kids splash around can only entertain you for so long. "You seem bored," she said, briefly taking her eyes off the pool. "Would you like to hear something interesting?" There was an odd tension in her voice that made me curious. "Are you sure you want to know?" she added, studying my face carefully. She told me she'd been working there for 3 summers, the longest of any recent lifeguard. Others usually quit within weeks, citing various reasons: strange noises, unexplainable shadows, an overwhelming sense of being watched. But Marina stayed, perhaps because she needed the job, or perhaps because she was drawn to the mystery of the place. 2 weeks ago, she began, lowering her voice. I arrived early for my shift. The morning fog was still clinging to the ground, making everything look surreal. That's when I saw it. Something was in the pool. At first, she thought it was a swimmer doing early morning laps, but as she approached, she realized the figure moved wrong, too fluid, too inhuman. It exploded out of the water, sending a cascade of droplets into the air. Marina froze, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The creature was massive, its skin a sickly shade of gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But what struck her most were its eyes. They glowed like dying embers in the morning mist. It noticed her and turned, revealing a face that seemed to shift between human and something else. Marina's training kicked in. She reached for her phone to take a picture. The camera click echoed in the morning stillness. The creature's head snapped toward her, its face contorting into something that might have been a smile, revealing teeth that looked unsettlingly human. Instead of fleeing, it rose from the water cascading off its grotesque form. It stood as tall as the fence, watching her with those burning eyes. Marina found herself paralyzed, caught between fear and fascination. The creature took a step toward her, then another, its movements jerky and unnatural. Just as it got within arm's reach, a car drove past the complex. The creature's head turned toward the sound, and in that moment of distraction, It melted back into the shadows of the surrounding pines, leaving only ripples in the pool as evidence of its existence. The police came, Marina continued, but they didn't find anything. Just some weird marks around the pool edge that nobody could explain. She showed me the photo on her phone. It was blurry, but I could make out a dark figure emerging from the water, its outline disturbingly unnatural. After her encounter, Marina noticed changes. The water temperature would drop inexplicably in certain areas. Sometimes, in the early morning or late evening, she would catch glimpses of something moving beneath the surface, something that didn't cast a proper shadow. She finished her story just as my kids were getting tired of swimming, looking at the now peaceful pool. It was hard to imagine such a creature lurking in its depths, but as we were leaving, I noticed Marina's eyes constantly scanning the water, watching for something that shouldn't be there. I never went back to that pool. Later, I heard they finally closed it down after several similar sightings. The complex stands abandoned now, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But sometimes, locals say, you can still hear splashing coming from the pool at night, even though it's been drained for years. This happened last December, right before Christmas. I'm a 32-year-old programmer, and between work and my introverted nature, I don't get out much. I've been relying on dating apps to meet people, which led to one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. I matched with Elena, who worked at the city administration. Her profile looked perfect, intelligent eyes, warm smile, interesting job. We had a great conversation online, and she suggested meeting at this charming old cafe in the historical district. The cafe was housed in a 19th century building with exposed brick walls and antique furniture. Elena was even prettier in person, dressed elegantly in a way that seemed almost too formal for a casual date. During our conversation, I learned she lived alone in one of those beautiful old apartments nearby, as her roommate was away for the holidays. She mentioned having trouble with a stalker ex-boyfriend, which raised a red flag, but she quickly dismissed it, saying he was harmless. We had a few more drinks, and she suggested we go back to her place. When I offered to drive, she insisted on taking her car, saying she'd seen too many DUI cases at work. Her apartment was in a grand old building with high ceilings and ornate moldings. What struck me as odd was that when we arrived, the front door was already unlocked. Given her stalker story, this seemed strangely careless. She didn't seem concerned at all. In the kitchen, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A bowl of cereal on the counter, the milk still white and fresh, the cereal not yet soggy. Before I could process this, Elena kissed me and guided me toward her bedroom. The rational part of my brain was screaming that something was wrong, but she was attractive, and I ignored my instincts. As we entered her room, she insisted on leaving the curtains open. A few minutes later, she suddenly gasped, her eyes fixed on the window. I turned to see a dark figure in a hoodie, who quickly disappeared. I heard footsteps running on the balcony outside. I jumped up and ran to check the doors. The front door was still unlocked, and just as I secured it, someone started pounding on it. I was ready to confront whoever it was, but Elena's reaction stopped me cold. She calmly told me to come back to bed, saying, "He does this and goes away." The banging moved to the other side of the house. Elena showed no fear, just kept trying to coax me back to the bedroom. I was trapped. My car was at the cafe, and I didn't dare call the police without knowing what kind of setup this was. My heart was racing, and I could taste metal in my mouth from the adrenaline. I started confronting her about the unlocked door, the cereal bowl, calling her out as a liar. She couldn't provide any logical answers, just kept insisting everything was fine. The banging continued, moving around the house in a pattern. The stranger would pound on one wall, stop, then start on another, like some twisted game of cat and mouse. I secretly ordered a rideshare on my phone while keeping her talking. When my ride arrived, I didn't announce it. I waited for the right moment when the banging was at the far side of the house, then bolted out the door. As I ran, I could see a figure rushing around the corner of the house, but I didn't stop to look back. I never found out what kind of trap I'd walked into. Was it a robbery scheme? Some kind of twisted game? I reported her profile on the dating app and warned the cafe staff about them. 2 weeks later, I was getting coffee at my usual spot when I overheard 2 cops talking about a disturbing case. They'd found a young woman's body in that same neighborhood. They mentioned finding fresh cereal bowls in multiple locations around the crime scene. I still don't know if there was any connection, but I've deleted all dating apps since then. Sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I remember the sound of that methodical banging moving around the house, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just a few minutes longer. I need to write this down before I convince myself it didn't happen. This occurred last December, during my visit to Uncle Peter's hunting lodge in Polesia, near the Belarusian border. He's the kind of man who prefers solitude, living in a wooden cabin deep in the ancient forest, where twisted pines rise from marshy ground and old folk tales still feel alive. The lodge stood isolated, with no neighbors for miles around, just the woods, the swamps, and whatever dwells in them. I never minded visiting. I liked the quiet, the way time seemed to slow down there. But after that night, everything changed. It was the coldest night of winter, with temperatures dropping to -30. Uncle Peter had gone to the nearby village for supplies, leaving me alone. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the old brick stove, and I was scrolling through my phone when I heard it, something moving outside. Not footsteps exactly, but a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. Then came the knock, not at the door, but at the window. 3 slow, methodical taps. I froze. The nearest village was 20 kilometers away, and no sane person would be out in this cold. The knocking came again. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it through the frost-covered window. What I saw standing just beyond the tree line still haunts me. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, but emaciated, with long, bony limbs. Its skin looked like frost-bitten bark, almost blackened, and its eyes, they weren't reflecting my light. They were glowing on their own, like burning coals buried in snow. I should have looked away. I should have pulled the heavy wool curtains shut, but I was frozen in place, unable to even breathe. Then it smiled. Its teeth were too numerous, too sharp, stretching across its face in a way that defied anatomy. It opened its mouth, wider than any human could, and then it spoke. "Let me in," it said. The voice was wrong, like an old recording played at the wrong speed. Too deep, too garbled. It reminded me of the way old villagers described the voices of forest spirits in their tales. But this was no benevolent woodland deity. I ran, grabbing Uncle Peter's old hunting rifle, locked the door, and retreated to the farthest corner of the room. The knocking stopped, but I could hear it scraping against the walls outside, slow and patient, like it had all the time in the world. I sat there for what felt like hours, rifle shaking in my hands, until finally I saw Uncle Peter's headlights sweep across the snow-covered yard. The second his lights touched the trees, the sound stopped. He found me pale, sweating, still gripping the rifle. I told him everything. He didn't say a word, just nodded and checked around the cabin. When he came back, he looked unsettled. There were no tracks in the snow. Nothing. That was impossible. I heard it, I saw it. But there was only pristine, untouched snow and the silent, watching trees. I left the next morning, but before I did, Uncle Peter told me something that still sends chills down my spine. "If you ever hear it again," he said, "don't look, and whatever you do, never let it in." The locals have stories about something that roams these woods on the coldest nights, something that's neither beast nor man. They say it's as old as the forest itself, and it hunts not for food, but for something else entirely. I don't know what it was I saw that night, but I know it's still out there, wandering the endless woods of Polesia, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of looking into those burning eyes. Living in a 1950s apartment building is like inhabiting a piece of history. But sometimes that history comes with unexpected dark corners. As a history student, I thought I'd appreciate the authentic atmosphere of my new home. A massive Stalinist-era building with thick walls, high ceilings, and a courtyard so deep it rarely sees direct sunlight. The apartment was part of a communal living arrangement common for buildings of that era. My room was spacious, with original hardwood floors and an ornate fireplace that hadn't been used in decades. The previous tenant had left suddenly, and the rent was surprisingly affordable for the city center. Nina Petrovna, my elderly neighbor, had lived in the building since it was first built. She remembered when the basement served as a bomb shelter, and she knew every creak and groan of the old structure. "This building has secrets," she would say, her eyes distant, some better left undisturbed. I first noticed something odd about 3 weeks after moving in. The building had this peculiar sound system: old pipes that carried sound between floors. Late at night, I would hear what sounded like children playing, their laughter echoing through the pipes. But according to Nina Petrovna, there hadn't been any children in our section of the building for years. Then came the footsteps. Every night around 3 a.m., I would hear someone walking in the corridor, slow, deliberate steps that would stop right outside my door. The first time I checked, there was nobody there, just the dim light of the corridor and the musty smell of old wallpaper. Vasily, the building's caretaker, was a gruff man who'd worked there for 30 years. When I mentioned the footsteps, he crossed himself and mumbled something about the building's history. During the war, he said, they used the basement for other purposes. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. One night, I was returning late from the library. The courtyard was darker than usual, the single lamp casting strange shadows on the peeling walls. That's when I saw her, a woman in what looked like an old-style nurse's uniform, walking toward the basement entrance. She moved strangely, as if each step was carefully choreographed. I called out, asking if she needed help. She turned, and I felt my blood freeze. Her face was wrong somehow, too symmetrical, too perfect, like a porcelain mask. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, which seemed to reflect light that wasn't there. She spoke, her voice echoing oddly in the courtyard. "Such a nice young man. Would you help me? I seem to have lost something in the basement." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I found myself taking a step forward. Nina Petrovna's voice cut through the strange trance. She was calling me from her window above. When I looked back, the woman was gone. Nina Petrovna insisted I come upstairs immediately. Over strong tea that smelled faintly of herbs I didn't recognize. She told me about the building's history during the war, how the basement had housed a secret hospital, and how not all patients were there willingly. There was a nurse, she said, her hands trembling slightly as she poured more tea. They say she still looks for her lost patients, those who help her search. They tend to disappear. Later that week, I found old newspapers in the city archive. In 1952, 3 young men disappeared from the building. Their last known location, the basement. Witnesses reported seeing them helping a nurse in a white uniform. I still live in the building. The footsteps continue, and sometimes I hear that strange laughter through the pipes, but I never answer my door after midnight, and I've learned to avoid the courtyard after dark. Some mysteries in this old building are better left unexplored. Some questions better left unasked. Last night, I heard those footsteps again, followed by a gentle knock. Through the peephole, I saw her, that perfect porcelain face, those empty eyes. She smiled, knowing I was watching. "Won't you help me?" she whispered, her voice distorting in impossible ways. I'm still looking for my patients. I stayed silent until she left, but sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I wonder, what exactly is she looking for in that basement, and what happened to those who helped her search? As an urban photographer, I've explored countless abandoned places, but what happened on that old railway bridge still haunts me. The structure was a relic from the 19th century, a massive iron beast spanning a deep river valley. Local historians say it was built during the industrial boom, but fell into disuse when the newer line was constructed in the 70s. I'd heard stories about the bridge from the station guard, an old man who'd worked there for 40 years. He spoke of strange occurrences, unexplained lights, mysterious figures, and the sound of phantom trains in the dead of night. I dismissed these as local folklore, the kind that always surrounds such places. That evening, I arrived just before sunset to capture the bridge in the golden hour light. The weather was turning, with heavy clouds rolling in from the east, creating dramatic shadows across the valley. The abandoned station platform stood empty, its crumbling concrete telling stories of bygone days. I was setting up my tripod on the bridge when the first drops of rain began to fall. The metal rails gleamed dully in the fading light, stretching into the mist that had begun to gather at the far end. Something about the atmosphere made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. I'd been in far more unsettling places. The rain intensified, and I was about to pack up when I saw her, a woman standing in the middle of the tracks, maybe 50 meters ahead. She wore what looked like an old-fashioned dress, completely inappropriate for the weather. My first thought was that she must be another photographer, maybe setting up some kind of artistic shot. I called out, warning her that the bridge wasn't safe in this weather. She didn't respond, but slowly turned toward me. The movement was wrong, somehow too fluid, as if she was floating rather than turning. That's when I noticed her feet weren't touching the rails. She began moving toward me, not walking, but gliding just above the tracks. Her dress didn't move in the wind that was now howling through the bridge's iron framework. As she got closer, I could see her face, or rather, the absence of distinct features, as if they had been worn away by time. My camera suddenly went dead, though I'd just charged the battery. The temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath misting in front of me, though it was a summer evening. She stopped about 10 meters away and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Have you seen my train?" she asked. It was supposed to arrive at 8:45. Her voice had an odd echo, like it was coming through an old phonograph. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. She drifted closer, and I could now see through her to the rails beyond. "I've been waiting so long," she continued, her voice becoming distorted. "They said it would come. They promised." Her form began to flicker like an old film projection. Suddenly, a real train whistle sounded in the distance. The evening freight on the new line. The sound seemed to agitate her. Her form became more solid, and the air around her began to crackle with a strange energy. "That's not my train," she screamed, her voice taking on an inhuman quality that made my bones vibrate. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life. Behind me, I could hear her wailing, the sound echoing off the valley walls. When I reached the platform, I risked a look back. She was standing at the edge of the bridge, her form now a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. Then she simply faded away, like mist in morning sun. Later, I researched the bridge's history. In 1893, a young woman named Maria disappeared there while waiting for an evening train. According to newspaper archives, she was supposed to meet her fiancé, who was arriving on the 8:45. The train never came. A bridge failure further up the line had forced it to divert. She was never seen again. I've given up urban photography since then. Some places hold onto their past too tightly, and some stories are better left untold. But sometimes, when I hear a distant train whistle, I think about her still waiting on that rusted bridge for a train that will never arrive. My German shepherd, Thunder, has never failed to protect me, but he's definitely not a guard dog by nature. He's more likely to greet intruders with a wagging tail than a threatening bark. That's why his behavior that night was so unsettling. I had recently moved into an old mansion on the outskirts of town. As an artist, I was drawn to its Victorian architecture and the way light filtered through its tall windows. The previous owners had maintained the original features: intricate wooden panels, ornate ceiling roses, and a grand staircase that creaked with every step. The surrounding garden was wild and overgrown, with twisted old apple trees casting strange shadows in moonlight. The house came with its share of stories. The real estate agent mentioned that it had stood empty for years. After the sudden death of its elderly owner, locals whispered about strange lights and unexplained sounds, but I dismissed these as typical small-town gossip. Besides, the rent was surprisingly affordable for such a magnificent property. That particular night, my roommate was away visiting family, leaving me alone with Thunder. It was around 8 in the evening when his behavior started to change. He had been lounging on his favorite spot near the bay window, when suddenly his ears perked up and his body tensed. At first, I thought he'd heard a fox in the garden. They often prowled around at night, but this was different. Thunder stood up, his hackles raised, and let out a low growl. Something I'd never heard from him before. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, tracking something I couldn't see. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't respond to my voice. He kept staring upward, his eyes following something as it seemed to move across the ceiling. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I could see his breath misting in the air. Suddenly, he bolted to the grand staircase and stood at the bottom, growling at something at the top. His tail was tucked between his legs, but he maintained his protective stance between me and whatever he was seeing. The old chandelier above us started to sway slightly, though there was no breeze. Then came the sound, a soft humming, like someone singing a lullaby, floating down from the upper floor. Thunder's growl deepened, and he began backing up, pushing me away from the stairs. The humming grew louder, and with it came the distinct sound of footsteps on the landing above. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but it was dead, though I'd charged it just hours before. The footsteps started descending the stairs, each step accompanied by a loud creak of old wood. Thunder's behavior became increasingly agitated. He positioned himself firmly in front of me, his body trembling, but his stance unwavering. The temperature continued to drop until I could see both our breaths in the air. The footsteps reached the middle of the staircase, but there was nothing visible there, just empty space and swirling dust in the beam of moonlight from the landing window. Thunder suddenly let out a bark that seemed to shake the whole house. It was followed by complete silence. The humming stopped. The footsteps ceased. The temperature gradually returned to normal, and Thunder's posture relaxed slightly, though he refused to leave my side for the rest of the night. The next morning, while Thunder slept exhausted by my feet, I did some research about the house. The elderly owner hadn't simply died. She had fallen down those very stairs. According to local papers, she had been known for singing lullabies to the neighborhood children from her window each evening. That was 6 months ago. We still live in the house, but Thunder has developed a routine. Every evening at 8, he stations himself at the bottom of the stairs and stands guard for exactly 1 hour. Sometimes I hear that faint humming, and on cold nights I can see his breath in the air as he watches something I can't see. I've come to believe that Thunder isn't just protecting me from whatever haunts these stairs. He's also protecting it from leaving them, like some unspoken agreement between between a loyal dog and a lonely spirit, both standing guard in their own way over the house and its inhabitants. Working night shifts at the hospital, I'm used to walking home through the old part of the city. The narrow cobblestone streets and dim gas lamps usually give the area a romantic feel. But that night was different. The October fog had rolled in thick from the river, turning familiar landmarks into looming shadows. I'd just finished a 12-hour shift in the emergency ward. It was 3 in the morning, and the streets were empty except for the occasional stray cat. The usual route home took me past the abandoned textile factory, its broken windows like dark eyes watching the street below. The first sign something was wrong came when I heard footsteps behind me. Not the sharp click of normal shoes on cobblestones, but a soft, deliberate shuffle. I glanced back, but could only see a dark figure in the fog, too far to make out clearly. Something about their movement seemed odd, almost mechanical. I picked up my pace, my shoes echoing off the old buildings. The footsteps behind me quickened to match. My heart started racing as I realized the person was definitely following me. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead, and the old street lamps cast more shadows than light. Turning onto Cathedral Street, I passed the night watchman outside the old bank. He nodded as usual, but when I looked back again, I couldn't see him anymore, just that dark figure, closer now, still moving with that strange, shuffling gait. The fog seemed to thicken, muffling all sound except those footsteps. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in the silence. The street ahead split into 3 narrow alleys. I knew the middle one led to the main road, where there might be taxis, or at least more people. Just as I reached the intersection, a car's headlights swept across the street. In that brief moment of illumination, I caught a glimpse of my pursuer. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and wore what looked like an old-fashioned doctor's coat, dark with age or dirt. But what made my blood freeze was their face, or rather, the ancient-looking surgical mask that covered it, stained with something I didn't want to identify. I ran. The cobblestones were slick with fog dampness, and my shoes kept threatening to slip. Behind me, the shuffling had turned to a rapid clicking sound, like metal on stone. I could hear breathing that wasn't my own, raspy and mechanical. Getting closer, a taxi turned onto the street ahead, its yellow light like a beacon in the fog. I waved frantically, and it slowed. Just as I reached for the door handle, I felt something cold brush against my back. The taxi driver's eyes widened as he looked past me. I practically dove into the back seat, yelling at him to drive. As we pulled away, I looked back through the rear window. The figure stood in the middle of the street, unnaturally still. Then it raised one long, thin arm and pointed at me before disappearing into the fog. The driver kept looking at me in his rearview mirror. "You saw it too?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "That thing's been spotted around the old hospital district for weeks. Always at night, always following medical staff. Some say it's wearing one of those plague doctor masks from centuries ago." When I got home, I researched the area's history. The old textile factory had originally been a quarantine hospital during a plague outbreak in the 19th century. Records mentioned a doctor who continued treating patients long after the outbreak ended, claiming they could still hear the disease in people's breathing. I requested a transfer to day shifts after that night. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick from the river, I can still hear that shuffling sound outside my window, and on particularly dark nights, I swear I see a tall figure in an old doctor's coat, standing perfectly still, watching the hospital with empty eyes behind its ancient mask. I was 11 when the incident happened, living with my sisters in a grand wooden mansion that had stood since 1890. The house was a masterpiece of old craftsmanship, with intricate carvings on every doorframe, and a sprawling garden dominated by a crumbling fountain. My older sister Anna was 14, while my younger sister Kate had just turned 9. Our parents traveled frequently for work, leaving us in the care of Galina Stepanovna, an elderly housekeeper who had served the previous owners. She knew every creaking floorboard, every hidden corner of the mansion, though she never spoke about the attic. "Some doors," she would say, crossing herself, "are better left closed." The house had its own rhythm. The grandfather clock's steady heartbeat in the hall, the whisper of wind through the garden's ancient linden trees, the subtle shifting of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. We knew these sounds intimately, which is why we noticed immediately when something changed. It started with footsteps in the attic, not the usual settling of old beams, but deliberate steps moving back and forth above our bedrooms. Anna, being the oldest, dismissed our fears at first. "It's just the house breathing," she'd say, though I could see doubt in her eyes. One evening, while our parents were away at a conference, we heard something new, the sound of children laughing upstairs. Galina Stepanovna was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and we were the only children in the house. The laughter echoed through the heating vents, accompanied by the sound of something rolling across the attic floor. Kate, despite being the youngest, was always the bravest. "We should investigate," she declared. Anna protested, but curiosity overcame caution. We knew where the attic key was kept, in a small box in our father's study, though we were strictly forbidden to use it. The attic stairs creaked under our feet as we ascended. The door was heavy oak, with a brass keyhole that seemed to watch us like an accusing eye. The key turned with difficulty, as if something on the other side was resisting. The attic was a vast space, filled with sheets of canvas over old furniture. Dust motes danced in the beams of light from the dormer windows. Everything seemed normal at first, until we noticed the marble, a single glass sphere rolling slowly across the wooden floor, though there was no slope for it to follow. Then we saw the rocking chair begin to move, its wooden runners creaking against the floorboards. No breeze stirred the dust. No draft moved the covered furniture. The marble stopped its journey and rolled back the way it had come, as if someone had flicked it with an invisible finger. Anna grabbed our hands, ready to retreat, when we heard it, a child's voice, clear as day. "Will you play with us?" The temperature dropped suddenly, our breath visible in the cold air. The voice came again, closer. "We've been so lonely," we ran. The door slammed behind us, with such force it shook the entire staircase. That night, the sounds above were louder than ever running footsteps, laughter, the rolling of marbles. We huddled in Anna's bed, too terrified to sleep. The next morning, Galina Stepanovna found us there. Looking at our pale faces, she finally told us the story. In the early 1900s, the house belonged to a wealthy merchant. His 3 children, all close to our ages, died in a fire that started in the attic. Their playroom had been up there, full of toys and games. "They've been waiting," she said softly, "for someone to play with. But their games, they don't end well for the living." We never went to the attic again, but sometimes, late at night, we'd hear the familiar sound of children playing above. On quiet evenings, we could hear marbles rolling across the ceiling, following paths only they could see. The laughter continued, distant and lonely, until we finally moved away years later. Recently, I drove past the old house. New owners had renovated it completely, except for the attic. Those windows remained dark and shuttered. As I watched, I saw something small and round roll past one of the dormer windows. It looked like a marble, caught in an endless game with players long gone from this world. I experienced something truly extraordinary during my hiking trip in the Carpathian Mountains last Christmas. Being an experienced hiker, I decided to explore a remote trail that wound through dense pine forests and steep, rocky slopes. The weather was perfect, crisp mountain air, and clear skies made it ideal for photography and nature observation. However, my peaceful excursion took an unexpected turn when I encountered a rare mountain plant I'd never seen before. Within minutes of brushing against it, my skin began to burn and my throat started closing up. I immediately recognized the signs of a severe allergic reaction and knew I needed to get back to civilization quickly. The problem was, in my disoriented state, I had lost track of the correct path down the mountain. The rocky outcrops all looked the same, and the winding trails seemed to merge into one another. My vision was becoming blurry, and panic started to set in. as I realized how serious the situation was becoming. That's when something remarkable happened. A large black raven appeared, landing on a branch just 15 feet away from me. What caught my attention wasn't just its size or proximity, but the fact that it had what appeared to be a small bell tied around its neck. Something I'd never seen on a wild bird before. At first, I paid little attention to it, too focused on trying to find my way back. But as my condition worsened and confusion deepened, the raven began to act strangely. It would fly short distances, land on branches, and make loud, distinctive calls. When I didn't follow, it would return closer to me and repeat the process. In my desperate state, something told me to follow this unusual bird. Every time I'd slow down or start to veer off in a different direction, it would swoop down close to me, cawing insistently until I corrected my course. What happened next still amazes me to this day. This mysterious raven led me straight back to the ranger station at the base of the mountain. The moment I stumbled into the station, the bird disappeared into the forest. The rangers immediately recognized my condition and called for medical help. I later learned that I had arrived just in time, another 30 minutes, and my throat might have closed completely. I've spent countless hours thinking about that day. The raven had to have been someone's trained bird. But who would train a raven to help lost hikers? And how did it know I was in distress? The rangers told me they'd never heard of anyone keeping trained ravens in the area. The incident has left me with more questions than answers. But one thing is certain. That bell-wearing raven saved my life that day. Sometimes I still hear its distinctive call when I'm hiking in those mountains, though I've never seen it again. The mystery of its appearance and perfectly timed intervention continues to warm my heart to this day. Thank you, mysterious raven, wherever you came from. You were my guardian angel that Christmas day. It was a chilly autumn evening in a small Estonian town when everything happened. I was 18 and in the middle of a heated argument with my boyfriend over text messages. Our relationship was rocky at best, mainly due to his inability to communicate properly. After several angry exchanges, I decided I needed some air to clear my head. Living on the outskirts of town meant my neighborhood consisted mostly of dimly lit country roads bordered by dense pine forests. The main road near my house had no sidewalks, just narrow strips of wild grass along both sides. Despite the less than ideal conditions and the late hour, around 6 in the evening, I decided to go for a walk anyway. As I approached the old railway bridge, I paused at the top to watch the occasional truck pass underneath, wondering about their destinations and the stories of their drivers. There was a homeless shelter nearby, and although I'd never had any troubling encounters before, something felt different that night. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with an unseen tension. That's when I felt hands wrapping around my waist, firm and unwelcome. For a split second, my romantic teenage brain foolishly hoped it was my boyfriend coming to apologize. It wasn't. I found myself turned forcefully toward two men, both appearing to be in their 30s. They were wearing baggy clothes and carried plastic shopping bags that clinked with every movement. They spoke to each other in Russian, their laughter echoing in the darkness. The man holding me didn't speak Estonian, but his friend did. They started asking questions, my name, where I lived, why I was out so late. I remained frozen, literally paralyzed with fear, but somehow managed to answer their questions, thinking it was the safest approach. The grip on my waist tightened as they continued their interrogation. I lied about my age, telling them I was 16, hoping it would deter them. They asked if I wanted to come with them to the shelter, I assumed. The man's hold grew even tighter, and I could feel his excitement building. I told them my boyfriend was meeting me here. Another lie that might save my life. Their questions continued, but the man's grip loosened slightly, taking advantage of this moment. I broke free and ran as fast as I could to the other end of the bridge, in the opposite direction from where they had been heading. I collapsed on a bench in the village square, screaming and crying. People walked past, but no one stopped to ask if I was okay. I called my boyfriend, and he walked me halfway home. To this day, I've never crossed that bridge again, regardless of the time of day. Looking back now, I realize how differently things could have ended. While the bruises faded, the memory of those moments on the bridge remains vivid. Those men are still out there somewhere, and I hope our paths never cross again. This happened last January, during one of those bitterly cold winter evenings in Stockholm. I'm a 34-year-old Australian exchange professor at the local university, and between my research and teaching schedule, I barely had time for socializing. Like many others in my situation, I relied on dating apps to meet new people. I matched with this interesting woman around my age. She worked as an administrator at the Maritime Museum, which sparked some engaging conversations about local history. We scheduled our first date at a cozy bistro in the old town, equally convenient for both of us. The restaurant was this charming place with exposed brick walls and candlelight, perfect for a first meeting. During our conversation, I learned more about her life. She mentioned living with a roommate who was currently traveling through Norway for the winter holidays. She also shared that she had some troubles with an obsessive ex-colleague. Nothing too serious, she assured me, just someone who couldn't take no for an answer. After a few glasses of wine and great conversation, she suggested we continue the evening at her place. I was hesitant at first, but she was attractive and we seemed to click well. However, things started feeling off almost immediately after we arrived. First, she just opened her front door without unlocking it. For someone who mentioned having problems with a stalker, this seemed strangely careless. Then I noticed a bowl of still cold yogurt with granola on the kitchen counter. The granola hadn't even started to get soggy yet, suggesting it had been prepared very recently. Before I could process these red flags, she kissed me and guided me toward her bedroom. Despite my growing unease, I found myself following her. We entered her room, and I moved to close the curtains. She immediately told me to leave them open. We'd been there maybe 5 minutes when she suddenly gasped loudly, her eyes fixed on the window. I turned around to see a dark figure in a navy peacoat running away from the window. I could hear heavy footsteps on her wooden balcony. I immediately jumped up to check if all the doors were locked. Of course, the front door wasn't. As I moved to lock it, someone started pounding on it violently. She calmly told me to ignore it and come back to bed, saying he does this and eventually leaves. The banging moved to the other side of the house, but she remained unnaturally calm, still trying to convince me to return to bed with her. I couldn't believe what was happening. I didn't want to call the police. What if this was some elaborate setup? What if the guy was a cop himself? The banging continued, moving around the house in a horrible rhythm. My adrenaline was pumping so hard, I could taste metal in my mouth. I felt trapped and terrified. With no car to escape in, since we'd taken her vehicle from the restaurant, I started confronting her about the unlocked door and the fresh yogurt bowl. She couldn't provide any logical explanations, just kept insisting I should come back to bed. The banging would stop momentarily, then start again at a different part of the house. In my panic, I warned her that if this was some kind of setup for a robbery or worse, they'd have a serious fight on their hands. While she was distracted, I managed to order a rideshare on my phone. I stayed by the door, fully dressed, keeping her talking until I saw the car's headlights outside. Without a word, I yanked the door open and ran. I caught a glimpse of someone in a peacoat running around the corner of the house, but I didn't stop. I jumped into the car, and as we pulled away, I looked back to see her standing in the doorway, completely calm, watching me leave. A week later, I happened to drive past that bistro where we'd met. The same woman was there, sitting with another man, likely setting up her next victim. I reported her dating profile, but I still wonder what their real plan was that night. Was it a robbery, some sort of twisted game, or something even worse? The whole experience taught me a harsh lesson about trust and dating in a foreign country. I've since moved to a different part of the city and become much more cautious about who I meet and where. But sometimes, late at night, I still wonder about what might have happened if I hadn't managed to get out when I did. need to write this down before I convince myself it never happened. This experience occurred last February while visiting my aunt in northern Iceland, near the Arctic Circle. She's one of those people who prefer solitude, living in a modern cottage perched on the edge of a volcanic field. No close neighbors, just endless black rocks covered with green moss, and the occasional steam vent releasing ghostly vapors into the air. I never minded visiting during the endless summer days, but winter was different. The perpetual darkness made everything feel more intense, more threatening. One night, when the temperature had dropped to -25°C, my aunt had gone into town for supplies, leaving me alone. The cottage was warm, the fire crackling in the modern wood stove, and I was scrolling through my phone when I heard it, not footsteps, but something more disturbing. It sounded like something being dragged across the volcanic rocks, slow and deliberate. At first, I dismissed it as the wind until I heard the knock. It didn't come from the door, but from the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the lava field. 3 slow, purposeful taps. I froze. The nearest neighbor was kilometers away, and no sane person would be out in this cold, in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it through the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was something standing just beyond the edge of the lava field. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 2.5 meters, but emaciated, with long, spindly limbs. Its skin looked frozen, almost blue-black in color, and its eyes were glowing, not reflecting my light, but actually glowing like hot coals buried in volcanic ash. I should have looked away. I should have closed the thermal curtains, but I was frozen in place, unable to breathe. Then it smiled. Its teeth were too numerous, too sharp, stretching across its face in an impossible grin. It opened its mouth, wider than any human could, and then it spoke. Let me warm myself. The voice was wrong. It sounded like multiple recordings played simultaneously, too deep, too distorted. I ran to the other side of the room, grabbed my aunt's hunting rifle, locked the door, and backed into the farthest corner. The knocking stopped, but I could hear it scraping against the metal walls outside, slow and patient, like it had all the time in the world. I sat there for what felt like hours, rifle shaking in my hands, until my aunt's headlights finally swept across the lava field. The second her lights touched the rocks, the noises stopped. She found me pale, sweating, and gripping the gun like my life depended on it. I told her everything. She didn't say a word, just nodded and checked around the cottage. When she came back, she looked unsettled. There were no tracks in the fresh snow, she said. Nothing. That was impossible. I heard it, I saw it. But there was no trace of anything outside, just untouched snow and black volcanic rock. I left the next morning and haven't been back since. My aunt still lives there, but she told me something before I left. If you ever hear it again, she said, don't look, and whatever you do, never invite it in. I haven't told anyone else until now, but I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there, wandering the volcanic fields of Iceland, waiting for someone to let it in from the cold. This happened about a week before Lunar New Year in Singapore. I'm a 31-year-old marine biologist, currently working at the local aquarium. My everyday routine involves taking the metro to work. But one particular evening changed how I view my seemingly safe surroundings forever. I was heading home after a late-night inventory check at the aquarium. The tropical heat was still lingering even at 4 in the morning, making the air feel thick and heavy. As I approached the crosswalk leading to my apartment complex, I noticed a man standing near the corner market, talking intensely on his phone. He seemed agitated, pacing back and forth while making animated hand gestures. I didn't think much of it until I realized he was walking parallel to me on the opposite side of the street. There was something off about his behavior. He kept glancing in my direction while maintaining his apparent phone conversation, despite the numerous security cameras that dotted the street. I felt increasingly uneasy when he suddenly shouted, "Hey!" To get my attention, I hesitated. His voice carried a strange urgency that seemed forced. He was wearing a crisp business suit, despite the hour and heat, which struck me as odd. Even stranger was the fact that he chose to call out to me when there were several other people closer to him, including a security guard at a nearby condominium. Against my better judgment, I acknowledged him with a cautious hello. He started talking, but I was too far away to hear him clearly, as my manta ray research project had made me somewhat recognizable in the area. I thought perhaps he was a curious local. I took a few steps closer to hear him better. "Could you help me find Marina Boulevard? My phone just died," he asked, holding up his phone. I immediately froze. I had clearly seen him talking on that same phone seconds ago, trying to rationalize the situation. I told myself perhaps he had 2 phones, but my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. I maintained my distance and noticed his companion emerging from the shadows of a nearby alley. Both men were well dressed, but seemed out of place at this hour, getting more suspicious by the second. I took a step back and noticed the first man's phone screen light up with an incoming call. My heart started racing as I realized I was potentially being set up. I quickly gave them directions to Marina Boulevard, pointing left while planning my escape route to the right. The moment I finished speaking, both men started moving toward me with purposeful strides. Without hesitation, I turned and ran toward the well-lit entrance of my apartment complex. The sound of rapid footsteps behind me confirmed my worst fears. They were pursuing me. I could hear them speaking to each other in hushed but urgent tones. Thanks to my regular swimming routine, I managed to maintain a good pace. I reached the security guard post just as one of the men was about to grab my arm. The guard, who knew me from my daily greetings, immediately stood up and reached for his radio. Both men quickly retreated, disappearing into the maze of side streets. After filing a police report, I learned that similar incidents had been reported in the area. Well-dressed men approaching people late at night, using the pretext of asking for directions. The police suspected they were part of a local tourist targeting scheme, but their exact intentions remained unclear. I've since changed my route home and never walk alone after midnight. The incident taught me that danger can look surprisingly professional, and that trust should be earned, not freely given. To this day, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run when I did. I need to share something that's been haunting me for years. It's about my father, a man I never truly knew, despite living under the same roof for most of my childhood. Growing up in a coastal town in southern Portugal, I was told my father worked as a yacht broker, dealing with wealthy clients who preferred discretion. He owned a small company that arranged private sales and offshore registrations. The kind of business where clients didn't ask too many questions, and neither did we. He was rarely home, always traveling up and down the coast, working on different projects. When he was around, the atmosphere would become tense and unpredictable. My mother would always apologize for his outbursts, and eventually I learned to make myself scarce during his visits. My older sister Maria, who was 8 years my senior, had an even more strained relationship with him. My younger brother Antonio, just a year younger than me, seemed to fly under his radar. It was mainly Maria, and I who bore the brunt of his volatile temperament. His drug use wasn't immediately apparent to me as a child. He had always enjoyed his Porto wine. But around the time I turned 14, things began deteriorating rapidly. One day, my mother finally stopped pretending everything was normal. She sat us down and told us about his cocaine addiction, the missing money, the anger, the fights. It all started making sense. By the time I was 13, he had practically vanished from our lives, taking sporadic business trips along the coast. His behavior became increasingly erratic. Sometimes he'd appear for a few days. Other times we wouldn't hear from him for months. My mother never divorced him, citing her deep Catholic faith, but their relationship had clearly become toxic. In 2018, something happened that still makes me sick to my stomach. One night, I received a call from my mother. My father had been arrested. A woman's body had been discovered behind a marina in the Algarve. She had been hidden under a pile of old fishing nets, and something about the scene immediately connected to my father. The police linked him to the crime because she had been seen with him on his boat just the day before. Initially, I thought it was another of his drug-related mishaps. Maybe she had overdosed, and he panicked. But the truth was far more sinister. The police report was horrifying. The woman hadn't overdosed. She had been beaten to death with a boat hook. The medical examiner found that her skull had been crushed by repeated blows. My father was arrested for murder, but somehow, through expensive lawyers and lack of definitive evidence, he was only charged with improper disposal of a body. His sentence, just 1 year, Maria Antonio, and I cut all contact with him. My mother, despite everything, still spoke to him and even visited him in prison. It confused and hurt me deeply that she could stand by him after everything he had done to our family. A few weeks after his arrest, I went home to spend time with my siblings. One night, after several glasses of Vinho Verde, I shared something I'd kept to myself for years. Once, when I was young, my father gave me a ride to school in his work van. I saw something strange wedged under the passenger seat. An expensive leather handbag. Nothing like what my mother would own. I remembered picking it up, examining its soft leather, wondering why it was there. I didn't ask him about it, and quickly forgot about it. When I mentioned this story to my siblings, the blood drained from their faces. Our father had spent most of his time traveling the coast, had possessions from other women, and now had been linked to a dead woman. He had never faced real consequences for his actions. I believe he's taken at least 2 lives, and it's possible that I witnessed evidence of that when I was a child. I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of it all, trying to convince myself that maybe I'm overthinking things, that maybe it's all just coincidence. But deep down, I know what kind of man my father is. The truth is, I don't think I'll ever be able to move past what I've learned about him. The picture-perfect memory of finding that handbag now haunts me with sinister implications, and the weight of this knowledge grows heavier with each passing year. I was hired as an overnight caretaker at what used to be an old monastery in southern Spain. The building was a massive stone structure, built in the 17th century, but meticulously maintained over the years. When I first arrived for my shift, I noticed how the other staff members gave me knowing looks, as if silently saying, "Good luck." My first unusual experience happened while doing laundry in the ancient basement. The washing machines were located in what used to be the monastery's wine cellar, with thick stone walls and beautiful vaulted ceilings. As I was folding sheets, I caught something in my peripheral vision. A tall figure in traditional monk's robes. When I turned to look directly at it, the figure simply nodded and vanished. During my next shift, around 4 in the morning, I was walking through the main chapel when I saw what appeared to be an elderly priest carrying an ancient leather-bound book. He was floating several inches above the stone floor. When he noticed me, he appeared as startled as I was before dissolving into thin air. After several similar encounters, I finally worked up the courage to ask our facility manager about the building's history. Her face grew serious as she asked if I knew what the monastery was used for before it became a care facility. When I said no, she explained that during the Spanish Inquisition, this monastery had served as a detention and interrogation center. She also revealed that maintaining staff had been extremely difficult because of the paranormal activity. The building still held echoes of its dark past. She then told me about a tragic incident. A young caretaker had been murdered in the facility 20 years ago. Her ex-boyfriend had managed to enter the building late at night, killed her, and hidden her body in the old well in the courtyard. The man who committed the murder appeared to me that very night, but not as a living person. He materialized in the hallway wearing prison clothes, his presence accompanied by an overwhelming sense of malice. The spirit had attached itself to me, and I inadvertently brought it home with me. My 15-year-old daughter saw him in our living room the next evening. I immediately began burning sage and performing cleansing rituals I had learned from the local Roma community. I demanded the spirit leave and never return. The heaviness in our home gradually lifted. I requested a transfer to another facility the next day. The building manager wasn't surprised. Most night staff lasted less than a month. Before leaving, she shared something else. During the Inquisition, countless people had been tortured and killed within those walls. Their spirits still lingered, bound to the ancient stones by their suffering. The monastery continues its operations, but I've never returned. The experience taught me that some buildings hold onto their history in ways we can't fully comprehend. Those old stones had absorbed centuries of pain and darkness, and sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, they release echoes of their terrible past. The image of that ghostly monk still haunts me, his silent nod seeming to acknowledge a shared understanding of the building's dark secrets. I've since learned to respect the boundary between the living and the dead, and to recognize that some places are better left to their memories and their ghosts. Out late, driving the other night, I encountered something that still sends shivers down my spine. I was returning from a midnight shift at the Geneva Observatory, where I work as an astronomical researcher. The route home takes me through winding mountain roads in the Swiss Alps, which are always eerie in the dark. But that night held something far more terrifying than usual. As I navigated a sharp bend in the road, my headlights illuminated a figure that made me slam on the brakes. A woman stood in the middle of the road, her arms raised in a stopping gesture. effectively blocking my path. The surrounding peaks were silhouetted against the starlit sky, creating an otherworldly backdrop to this unsettling scene. I had no choice but to stop. When my car came to a halt, she approached, gesturing for me to lower my window. Against my better judgment, I complied. She spoke in French-accented English, explaining that her partner had abandoned her after an argument at a nearby hiking trail. According to her story, she didn't even have her phone or wallet. They were still in his car. My initial sympathy quickly gave way to suspicion. Her story seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. Every potential question was preemptively answered. No phone, no wallet, no way to contact anyone. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that she wasn't alone out here. I imagined others hiding in the dense pine forest that lined the road, waiting for their opportunity. The situation felt increasingly like something from a crime documentary. Was this a setup for robbery, a kidnapping, or perhaps some kind of police sting operation? I'd seen too many news reports about similar incidents in these remote mountain passes. Her performance grew more desperate. She was nearly crying now, pleading for help. But something about her distress felt staged, unnatural. She wanted to use my phone, but I knew that would mean giving up my only means of communication. If I were to believe her story, she needed it just as much as I did right now. She wouldn't accept my refusal. When she started glancing around while speaking, I noticed how her eyes seemed to be signaling to something or someone in the darkness. I quickly turned off my interior lights in an attempt to see better into the surrounding forest. But the darkness was impenetrable. When I engaged my second door lock, she began pounding on my window. I started honking my horn repeatedly, and she threw herself onto my hood in response. Eventually, she released her grip, and I carefully pulled away, watching in my rearview mirror as she calmly sat down in the middle of the road, seemingly waiting for the next vehicle to come along. Something struck me as particularly wrong about her behavior. If she was truly stranded, why wasn't she walking toward the nearest town? The observatory was only 5 kilometers away, and there was a small village even closer in the other direction. My hands shaking, I called the local police and reported the incident. The next day, after my adrenaline had subsided, I transferred the dashcam footage to my computer as a backup. Later, discussing the incident with my colleague, she was furious that I hadn't helped the woman, but I still stand by my decision. The risk was simply too great. I later learned from the police that similar incidents had been reported along that same stretch of road. Visitors to the observatory being targeted by what appeared to be an organized group of highway robbers. They specifically chose that remote location because of its poor cell reception and distance from any police station. Whether I'm thought of as cruel or cowardly, doesn't matter to me. I was there, and I know better than anyone else how dangerous that situation felt. Sometimes, trusting your instincts means being willing to appear unkind in order to stay safe. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who has completely lost touch with reality? Not someone who's merely eccentric or acts unusually, but someone whose mind has truly fractured. I have, and the experience continues to haunt me. I work for an international tech company in Helsinki, managing several development teams. One of my direct supervisors, Victor, was always an easygoing person with a fantastic sense of humor. A tall, athletic Finnish man in his 40s who spent his weekends sailing in the archipelago. He was single with no children and often joked about having too much freedom. About a year ago, he stopped by my desk one morning, and I immediately noticed something was wrong. He seemed distant and tense, completely unlike his usual self. When I asked what was troubling him, he said he needed to discuss a situation privately. He explained that several years ago, before I joined the company, another woman had worked in our department. Marta wasn't in our division, but occasionally interacted with the management team, including Victor. She worked at the company for less than a year before announcing her relocation to Norway for marriage. That was that, until a few weeks ago, when Victor received a friend request from her on social media. He didn't think much of it and accepted, as he was connected with many former colleagues. She messaged him shortly after, and their initial conversation seemed normal, catching up on old times. He learned she had divorced and was considering moving back to Helsinki. The conversation remained professional until she asked if he would meet her for dinner during her upcoming visit. Victor politely declined, and at first she seemed to accept his response gracefully. Then everything spiraled out of control. Within hours, he began receiving erratic and insulting messages from her, ranging from calling him a coward to claiming she was the best thing he could ever hope for, and that he had ruined his only chance. Victor showed me some of these messages on his phone. They were disturbing in their intensity. He blocked her, assuming she was drunk and would eventually calm down. He was wrong. She began emailing both his personal and work accounts, alternating between desperate apologies, claiming she was intoxicated, and insisting she needed to see him. I would later help print these emails as evidence. They became increasingly incoherent and threatening. The situation escalated when Victor received a message from Marta's sister, Lisa, saying they needed to urgently discuss Marta. According to Lisa, something in Marta had snapped during her divorce. She had become obsessed with a man she called Victor. Though Lisa initially thought this was just divorce-related delusions, Lisa's warning came too late. Marta had already flown to Helsinki and was staying at a hotel near our office building. Victor discovered this when he arrived at work to find her waiting outside his office. She rushed to embrace him, reeking of alcohol at 9 in the morning. She rambled about getting her old job back and presented him with bizarre gifts, gift cards, snacks, and a framed photograph of herself. Victor managed to extract himself by claiming he had a meeting, immediately reporting the situation to HR. Later, Lisa sent Victor a photo of Marta dressed in men's clothing. She had sent it to her sister saying, "Now I can watch him without being noticed." This happened nearly a year ago, but things only escalated. Marta made multiple trips to Helsinki, attempting to corner Victor in the parking lot. He would find rambling letters on his car, sometimes identical copies written in different handwriting styles. She created numerous email accounts after each blocking, professing her love, claiming she had made him her life insurance beneficiary, and even sending emails pretending to be other men who wanted to date her if Victor would release his hold on her. The situation eventually reached the courts, and a restraining order was granted. This seemed to halt the harassment for a while. Victor finally started returning to his old self, but Monday morning changed everything. Victor came to my desk, visibly shaken, demanding to know who had placed letters on his desk. A thick stack of handmade cards and Valentine's letters from Marta had been found scattered across his office floor. The cleaning staff had found them and neatly arranged them on his desk, not knowing their significance. We later discovered she had somehow gained access to the building, but how she got past security remains a mystery. When Victor returned to his office to gather the letters for the police, he received a knock on his door. Opening it, he found Marta standing there, grinning. He told her he was calling the police and slammed the door. I received his panicked call moments later. By the time I reached his office, she was sitting cross-legged outside his door, humming to herself. The sight made my blood run cold. As I approached, she slowly turned her head toward me, and that's when I saw it, her eyes. They were completely devoid of life, dark, empty pools that seemed to look through me rather than at me. Her lips twitched into an unnatural smile, and she continued humming as if nothing was wrong. The police arrived shortly after, and she offered no resistance when they arrested her. She maintained that eerie humming as they led her away. She's in custody now for violating the restraining order, but both Victor and I remain deeply shaken by the experience. I will never forget those eyes, the complete absence of rationality, the void where a person's humanity should be. It's so chilling that someone can appear completely normal on the surface while harboring such darkness within. Back in 2011, I was part of a group of friends who had a tradition of going camping every Maybank holiday weekend in the Scottish Highlands. we chose a spectacular spot on the shores of Loch Lomond, where the crystal-clear waters reflected the towering mountains like mirrors. The location was on public land, but camping was permitted as long as visitors followed the leave no trace principles. The loch had a hydroelectric dam at one end, which meant during May the water levels were typically low, revealing ancient stone formations and Celtic ruins along the shoreline. Our chosen camping spot was positioned on a gentle slope overlooking the loch, with one campsite below us and another above. The first night passed without incident. During the second day, new campers arrived at the site below us. We didn't think much of it and continued enjoying ourselves, drinking whiskey and sharing stories around the campfire. Around midnight, the group below us became increasingly rowdy, their music growing louder and their shouting more aggressive. Our friend Hamish went down to politely ask them to turn down the volume. He returned moments later with a bloodied nose, telling us he was almost certain they were high on something stronger than alcohol. He said their behavior was erratic, and their pupils were massively dilated despite the darkness. The atmosphere shifted dramatically after that. The peaceful Highland night now felt threatening. I was exhausted and decided to retreat to my tent. While some friends, including Hamish and a couple, Isla and Duncan, were still awake, they had made friends with another group of campers staying further up the hill. I was jolted awake, I'm not sure what time it was, by screaming and shouting from outside my tent. Parts of what followed are somewhat blurred in my memory, but I remember rushing outside to find our campsite in chaos. One of our friends was clutching their chest. People were running around frantically, calling for emergency services. I quickly learned what had happened. Shortly after I'd gone to bed, the people from the lower campsite had decided they weren't finished with Hamish. On their way up, they encountered Isla and Duncan returning from visiting the other campers. Mistaking Duncan for Hamish in the darkness, they were similar in height, and both had ginger hair. They attacked both of them with glass bottles. I didn't see all the men who came to our campsite, but I was told there were 3 of them. One brandished a fishing knife, while another held what appeared to be a hunting knife. When Hamish stood up to talk to them, the one with the fishing knife stabbed him in the chest without warning. Tim, one of the campers from the site above, who had seen the men approaching, came down to help. As he descended the hill, the man with the hunting knife charged at him and stabbed him in the stomach. Pure chaos erupted after that. People were calling emergency services, but we were at least 40 minutes from the nearest hospital. The situation was dire. Tim was losing blood rapidly. His friends made the decision to put him in their car and speed off to meet the ambulance halfway. Hamish's wound, while serious, wasn't as deep, and we managed to keep him calm until help arrived. The attackers fled back down to their campsite and attempted to escape in their Range Rover. My boyfriend and I got in his car and drove to the park entrance to flag down the police. They informed us to stay in the car as they had deployed police dogs to track the assailants. The men's escape attempt proved futile. They tried to drive across the exposed lock bed where the water was low, but their vehicle became stuck in the muddy sediment. When they were apprehended, the police confirmed they were under the influence of multiple substances. Thankfully, both Tim and Hamish survived, though Tim lost a dangerous amount of blood and took several weeks to recover. Duncan and Isla suffered severe concussions from the bottle attacks. Some of us had to testify in court against the attackers. The incident changed everything about how we viewed our favorite camping spot, a place that had once been our peaceful highland retreat, had been transformed by violence into something darker. We continued camping in the years that followed, but never returned to Loch Lomond. The memory of that night's events still casts a shadow over what was once our perfect escape into nature. This happened during a research expedition in northern Norway, about a week before the winter solstice. I had been granted access to conduct geological studies at an isolated research station that monitored seismic activity. The facility sat perched on the edge of a dramatic fjord, surrounded by ancient pine forests and towering cliffs. My work required me to stay alone at times, while other researchers conducted field studies. The station was well equipped with modern security systems and emergency communications, which initially gave me confidence despite the isolation. However, one particular night changed my perspective on solitude forever. Around 3 a.m, during the perpetual Arctic darkness, I heard what sounded like a vehicle pulling into the station's small parking area. This was unusual. No one was scheduled to return until morning, and the weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Looking through the security cameras, I noticed a red snowmobile, but couldn't identify the driver in the swirling snow. The person seemed oddly casual about being at a restricted research facility in the middle of the night. Through the cameras, I watched as they walked directly to our main entrance without hesitation. Something felt wrong. When they reached the door, instead of using the intercom or showing any form of identification, they simply tried the handle repeatedly. I stayed quiet, hoping they would leave. Instead, the person moved to check our emergency exit, then proceeded to examine our storage facility's door. Each attempt to gain entry became more aggressive. By now, my instincts were screaming that this wasn't a lost traveler or another researcher. The stranger's behavior became increasingly erratic. They circled the building, testing every possible entry point. I watched through different camera feeds, as they meticulously worked their way around the structure. When they reached the backup generator housing, they spent several minutes examining it, as if looking for a way to cut power to the facility. Through the thermal imaging cameras, I could see they were carrying something long and metallic, possibly a crowbar or similar tool. The way they moved suggested they were familiar with the layout of research stations. This wasn't random. It felt methodical and planned. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were no tracks behind the snowmobile in the fresh snow. It was as if it had materialized in our parking area, rather than being driven there. When I switched to the external temperature sensors, they showed minus 40 degrees Celsius conditions that would be deadly for anyone exposed for more than a few minutes. Yet this person showed no signs of being affected by the extreme cold. I activated our emergency protocols and contacted the nearest police station via satellite phone. They assured me help was on the way, but the worsening storm meant it would take at least 2 hours for them to reach us. The stranger continued their methodical exploration of the facility. Eventually, they returned to the main entrance and began pounding on the door with significant force. I watched in horror as they produced what appeared to be a modern electronic lock-picking device, something only law enforcement or security services would typically possess. Just as they were about to attempt to bypass our security system, a remarkable thing happened. The aurora borealis suddenly intensified dramatically, bathing everything in an otherworldly green glow. The person stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky. Then, without any apparent reason, they returned to their snowmobile and drove off into the darkness. When the police finally arrived, they found no traces of the snowmobile tracks, despite the fresh snow. The security footage showed everything clearly, but the incident raised more questions than answers. Who was this person? How did they know the facility's layout? And most disturbing of all, why did they leave so suddenly? The police investigation revealed that several other research stations in the region had reported similar incidents, always during the darkest part of winter, always involving a red snowmobile, and always during periods of intense aurora activity. None of these cases were ever solved. I still work at remote research stations, but I've never felt quite as secure since that night. Sometimes, when the aurora dances across the Arctic sky, I find myself checking the security cameras more frequently, half expecting to see that red snowmobile materialize once again in the endless polar night.
My boyfriend Mike and I were excited to try out our new camping setup, a tent that could attach to the car for extra storage space. We had planned a weekend of hiking through the blooming spring forests, followed by stargazing from our campsite. The weather forecast promised clear skies, perfect for our first camping trip of the season. All the state parks were booked solid. Apparently, Everyone had the same idea about enjoying the first warm weekend of spring. After searching online, we found this website that worked like Airbnb for private camping spots. We came across this interesting listing: a 100-acre apple orchard just 15 minutes away from our planned hiking trail. The property seemed perfect. It had basic amenities like restrooms and outdoor showers, allowed campfires, and you could drive right up to your camping spot. The old apple barn had been converted into a sort of community space, complete with a small kitchen. What really caught our attention were the reviews. 3 5-star ratings talking about the peaceful atmosphere and beautiful surroundings. The owner, Tom, communicated only through text messages, but seemed friendly enough. We arrived later than our planned 11 a.m. check-in time, but kept him updated about our delay. When we finally pulled up to the address, we found ourselves facing an impressive old barn with fairy lights strung across its weathered wooden facade. While we were trying to get enough signal to text Tom about our arrival, an older man in his 60s pulled up in a green utility vehicle. He introduced himself as Tom's brother-in-law, explaining that Tom was busy with the early spring pruning in the orchard. The man was covered in wood chips and dirt, as if he'd been working outside all day. He told us we could set up anywhere on the property, and even offered to show us around on his utility vehicle. Mike, clearly uncomfortable, politely declined and asked about the boundaries of the camping area. The man casually mentioned that we could camp anywhere, even offering to help if our car got stuck in the spring mud. When we asked about cell service, he made a joke about reception being better on one side of the barn than the other. Something about his delivery felt off. His accent didn't match the local way of speaking, despite him claiming to be from the area. We decided to explore on foot first. The barn was well maintained and surprisingly modern inside, with string lights creating a cozy atmosphere even in daylight. The kitchen looked recently renovated, though we were warned not to drink the tap water. Behind the barn stood an old stone building that must have been the original cider press house, and beyond that, trails led into the budding orchard. After a short walk through rows of twisted apple trees just starting to show their spring buds, we found a perfect spot near a small stream, using our car as a windbreak. We left to grab dinner in town and asked Tom about the fire pit policy. He texted back, saying they'd leave one by the barn for us to use. When we returned about 90 minutes before sunset, the barn's fairy lights were off. We assumed they were on a timer to save electricity. The fire pit hadn't been delivered yet, but we started setting up our camp in the humid spring air. A brief shower forced us to wait in the car, playing cards until it passed. Needing to use the restroom, we walked back toward the barn. As we passed the old cider house, we heard strange, shuffling sounds from inside. I tried to convince Mike it was just the old wood settling, but something felt wrong. At the barn, the lights were still off. We found the fire pit had been delivered, but when we went inside to use the restroom, none of the light switches worked. We assumed the power was out from the rain. But as we stepped 10 feet away from the barn, we heard a mechanical hum, and the lights flickered back on. We changed direction to use the bathroom, and as soon as we stepped inside, the power cut again. I nervously joked to Mike, maybe they're watching us. The moment we stepped outside, the lights came back on. Mike said we needed to leave, and I felt the same primal fear gripping my chest. We went back to grab the fire pit since we'd moved it, and the barn lights began to flicker eerily. We walked briskly back to our campsite, growing up in rural areas. I knew running would only make things worse. Our 30-minute setup was torn down in 5 minutes flat. Just as we pulled onto the main road, Mike looked back and saw a figure standing by the cider house, watching us leave. Almost immediately, my phone lit up with a text from Tom offering us shelter in the barn if the rain had ruined our camping plans. We drove straight to a hotel in town, splurging on a nice room for safety. The elderly receptionist who checked us in looked troubled when we told her what happened. She asked if we'd seen the recent news about disappearing couples in the area. 3 couples had gone missing while camping, and one was found barely alive on the highway with severe injuries. Back in our room, I texted Tom to say we wouldn't be staying. His reply was unnervingly cheerful. "Thank you for staying with us." I can still feel that primal fear when I think about that night, that instinct telling us something was deeply wrong. That feeling of being watched still makes my throat tight when I recall it. To the figure by the cider house who watched us drive away, let's never meet again. They say you inherit your temper from one of your parents. I got mine from my father. My mother was more of a slow burner. She'd keep everything bottled up until one day she'd explode, listing every single thing I'd done wrong in the past year. But my father, he'd let you know exactly what you'd done wrong the moment you did it. And if you were smart, you'd make yourself scarce, preferably on the other side of town. I definitely took after my father. When something made me angry, everyone within earshot would know about it. Sometimes this hot temper got me into trouble, but on one rainy evening in 1982, it probably saved my life. I was 20 years old, working part-time at River Valley Mall while attending college full-time. The mall was one of those sprawling 2-story buildings with a massive parking structure attached to it. Being just a retail worker, I had to park on the outer edges of the parking garage, leaving the prime spots for customers. The walk never bothered me. I was young, fit, and enjoyed the exercise. That particular evening, I wasn't just walking to my car, I was storming to it. Mr. Thompson, the store manager, had just informed me that I hadn't gotten the office position I'd applied for. Looking back now, working full-time while maintaining my college schedule would have been impossible. But at that moment, all I could think about was how unfair it all was. The rain was coming down in sheets as I made my way through the near-empty mall. My heels clicked angrily against the tiled floor, each step fueled by frustration. I hadn't lost my temper in the store, but I carried it with me like a storm cloud as I pushed through the heavy doors into the parking garage. By 9:30, the garage was mostly empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating pools of harsh light between long shadows. I vaguely remember passing a woman getting into her car on the second level. But after that, it was just me and the echo of my footsteps, until I noticed someone else's footsteps behind me. I was climbing the ramp to the 4th level where I'd parked, and the footsteps seemed to be getting closer. At that point in my life, I was used to male attention. I was pretty with my glasses on and turned heads when I took them off, once causing a man to walk straight into a lamppost. So if I thought about the footsteps at all, I assumed it was just some guy planning to ask me out. Boy, did he pick the wrong moment. As I reached for my keys, hearing the footsteps speed up behind me, I spun around 180 degrees without breaking stride. Thank you, college dance classes, and snapped, what? With enough venom to make a cobra think twice. The man's face, just a few yards away, transformed from a predatory leer to complete shock. His body went rigid, and he made this awkward, mechanical turn away from me. After a few more stiff steps, he disappeared back through the door to the 4th level. Strange, I thought, but I was too angry about the promotion to really process it. I got into my car, started it up, and drove home, still fuming about Mr. Thompson and his decision. As I passed the lower levels, I caught glimpses of the same man ducking between cars, as if he was hiding. It wasn't until much later that night, while venting to my coworker Patty about the promotion, that I mentioned the odd encounter. Patty went pale and pointed out how dangerous the situation could have been. I laughed it off, saying the guy was lucky to have escaped my bad mood. About a month later, whispers started circulating around the mall about women being followed to their cars and assaulted in the parking structure. The mall tried to keep it quiet, but female employees started parking closer to the entrance or walking out in groups. Some had their boyfriends or husbands pick them up after their shifts. I didn't think much about my encounter until we learned that they'd caught the guy, a slim, young man who used a knife to threaten his victims. That's when it finally hit me, my temper, which had always seemed like a liability, had actually protected me that night. The man who turned away from me so abruptly was probably surprised to have his predatory routine disrupted by unexpected anger instead of fear. I felt guilty for not reporting the incident. My description might have helped catch him sooner, but I'd been so consumed by my anger over the promotion that I hadn't recognized the danger. Perhaps it was after encountering me that he started carrying a knife, realizing he needed something more than surprise to overpower his victims. The River Valley Mall eventually changed its security policies, allowing employees to park wherever they wanted. By then, I had moved on to a different job, but I never forgot that night. I'm sure some people might find it hard to believe that pure anger could deter an attacker, but anyone who knew me back then would understand completely. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I never felt that level of confidence again, because I learned that night just how dangerous the world could be, even in familiar places. But I also learned that sometimes what we consider our worst traits might just turn out to be our best protection. Sometimes it's good to lose your temper. As the autumn was wrapping its cold fingers around the last remnants of warmth, my friend Lily and I decided to take an evening drive to Lake Morrison. I had grown up in this area, spending countless hours exploring the dense forest that surrounded the murky waters. Lily, who had only moved here recently, was eager to experience the wild beauty of these places, especially at night. I loved sharing spooky podcast stories and watching horror movies, which, as it turned out, would serve us well that night. We set out in my old Volkswagen Passat, a reliable 2003 model that had carried me through countless adventures on these winding roads. The familiar paved route eventually gave way to a narrow gravel path. Just beside the transition point lay a small clearing where people often parked their trucks and boats. As we passed by, I noticed the clearing was empty, typical for this time of night. It was 10 in the evening, and the autumn fog had begun its nightly dance over the lake's surface. We drove further, passing the old fishing cabin that hadn't seen life in years. The wooden dock stretched into the lake like a skeletal finger pointing into darkness. Through the thick mist, I caught sight of something unusual, a single amber light glowing near the shoreline. "Well, damn," I muttered, immediately regretting my choice of words when I saw Lily's concerned expression. This was, after all, her first nighttime excursion to the lake. "What's wrong?" Lily asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "That light over there," I gestured toward the shore. "I've never seen it before. I mean, some people fish at night, but that spot." I trailed off, remembering that the area was private property, marked by warning signs riddled with bullet holes. A clear message from owners tired of trespassers. My hands tapped nervously on the steering wheel as conflicting thoughts raced through my mind. I wanted to show Lily the beauty of the fog-covered lake under the autumn moon, but something felt off. Years of listening to true crime stories had taught me to trust my instincts. "I'm sorry, Lily," I said, slowing the car. "I know you wanted to see the lake, but that light shouldn't be there. I've never seen anyone use that section of the shore, especially not at night." Lily, bless her heart, didn't complain when I started to turn the car around. That's when the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I whispered, turning the key. The starter whined, but the engine refused to catch. Through the fog, I noticed movement, flashlight beams dancing between the trees. "Emma," Lily's voice was barely audible. "There's a truck pulling into the clearing we just passed." My blood ran cold as I tried the engine one more time. This time it roared to life. "Hold on to something," I warned. "This might get rough." I reversed faster than I should have on the gravel road, my headlights illuminating a scene that still haunts me. At least 6 men rushing around a white pickup truck, unloading what looked like a small boat. One man was pulling out something that gleamed in my headlights. I didn't wait to see more. I threw the car into drive and sped toward the main road, gravel spraying behind us. In my rearview mirror, I saw one of the men run after us before disappearing into the fog. "Were those people there when we drove past earlier?" I asked, pushing the old Volkswagen to 70 miles per hour on the empty road. "No," Lily replied, her voice steady despite the situation. "Definitely not. We had 8 miles of straight road ahead before reaching civilization." Every few seconds, I checked my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights emerging from the fog behind us. We didn't slow down until we reached the well-lit parking lot of a busy diner. We sat in the car, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why would anyone need to unload a boat in such a hurry, in the dark, on private property? Why did they appear so suddenly? And what was that light we saw? Lily suggested they might have been helping someone in trouble, but there was no public access to the lake from that point, and all the land was clearly marked as private property. I'm grateful we left when we did, so we didn't have to find out their true intentions. To this day, I still drive past that lake, but I never stop after sunset. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some nights are better spent in well-lit places, surrounded by other people. I've been driving trucks for 8 years now, mostly doing long-haul routes through the Southwest. The summer nights are usually my favorite. the air cooling down after the scorching day, stars scattered across the desert sky, and the peaceful solitude of the open road. This particular night, I was hauling refrigerated goods from Phoenix to Dallas. Left town around 6 in the evening, planning to make my first stop around 11. The road stretched endlessly ahead, my truck's headlights illuminating the dusty asphalt and the occasional tumbleweed. Around 11, I pulled into a small truck stop just off the interstate. It was one of those older places with a single fluorescent sign buzzing above the entrance. I parked my rig, grabbed my thermal mug, and headed inside for some fresh coffee and a quick bathroom break. When I came back out, the night air was still warm, carrying that distinct desert scent of sage and sand. I climbed back into my cab and took a moment to enjoy my coffee, scanning the nearly empty parking lot. Only 3 other trucks were there, a quiet night by any standards. That's when I noticed him, a figure standing in the shadows behind the building, barely visible in the dim light from the sign. He was just watching, not moving, not smoking, not on a phone, just staring in my direction. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I started up my engine and pulled back onto the interstate. The coffee was doing its job, keeping me alert as I watched the empty road ahead. About 30 minutes later, I caught something in my side mirror, just a quick flash of light, like a reflection. I kept checking my mirrors, but the road behind me seemed empty. Then it happened again. This time I caught it better, a black SUV, riding so close to my trailer I could barely see it in my mirrors. No headlights, just ghosting along behind me in the dark. I grabbed my radio. Breaker 19, this is Ice Queen. Anybody out there got eyes on a black SUV running dark on I-40 eastbound, mile marker 120? A familiar gravelly voice crackled back. Ice Queen, this is Old Jack. I'm about 10 miles ahead of you. Haven't seen anything yet, but I'll keep watch. Everything okay? Before I could respond, the SUV suddenly appeared in my left mirror, still running dark. I switched lanes and it followed. Switched back, it followed again. My heart was starting to race. Jack, this vehicle's playing games. No plates, no lights, riding my tail. Copy that, Ice Queen. Got a state trooper station coming up in about 15 miles. Want me to call it in? Before I could answer, the SUV dropped back and disappeared again. I kept driving for another 2 hours, tense and alert, but there was no sign of it. By 3 in the morning, my eyes were burning with fatigue. I decided to pull into a rest area for a few hours of sleep. It was just a simple parking area off the highway. No buildings, just a stretch of pavement surrounded by desert. I killed the engine, but kept my hand on the key. The silence of the desert pressed in around me as I reclined my seat. I must have dozed off quickly because the next thing I knew, I was opening my eyes to darkness. Something had woken me. Then I saw him, a face right outside my window, eyes wide and unblinking, staring in at me. I jerked upright as he reached for the door handle. I twisted the key and slammed the transmission into gear. As my truck roared to life, I caught movement in my mirror. The black SUV was parked behind me, its engine running. I grabbed the radio and called for help as I pulled out of the rest area. The SUV followed for a few miles before suddenly turning off onto a dirt road and disappearing into the desert night. Later, when I described everything to the state troopers, they told me there had been several reports of a similar vehicle in the area, usually targeting lone trucks at night. They never caught them, and I never found out what they wanted. These days, I still drive the same route, but I don't stop at that truck stop anymore, and I never sleep at rest areas. Sometimes, on dark nights in the desert, I still check my mirrors for vehicles running without lights, ghosting along behind my trailer. I had been working at Ocean Sushi Bar for about 6 months, juggling the job with my marine biology classes at the local college. The tips were decent, and being able to make deliveries in my own car meant extra cash for textbooks. Plus, our small seaside town was usually pretty peaceful, despite the recent string of robberies in the area. It was a typical spring evening, with a light drizzle painting the streets with reflections of the streetlights. My shift started at 5, and it had been steadily busy until around 8, when things suddenly went quiet. The rain had picked up, drumming steadily on the restaurant's windows. Around 9, an online order came in 3 specialty rolls and miso soup. The address was in one of those oceanfront neighborhoods where the houses were spaced far apart, connected by winding roads that followed the coastline. I loaded the order into my car and headed out. The roads were pretty empty, just the occasional car passing by. About 5 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. A dark sedan had pulled onto the road behind me. They maintained a constant distance, never passing even though I was driving below the speed limit due to the rain. When I turned onto the coastal road, I checked my mirror again. A few seconds later, those same headlights appeared around the corner. That's when I started to feel uneasy. What were the chances they were heading to the same secluded neighborhood? The road curved along the coastline, the ocean barely visible through the rain and darkness on one side, dense trees on the other. Houses appeared occasionally, some right by the road, others set back on private drives. I kept checking my mirrors, watching the car behind me. Finally, I spotted the house number I was looking for. I turned into the driveway, and to my relief, the sedan continued past. I felt silly for being so paranoid. The driveway was long, winding through a small grove of pine trees before opening up to the house. The house was dark except for a porch light. I got out with the delivery bag and rang the doorbell. No answer. I waited and rang again. After what felt like forever, a light came on inside, and a woman in her 50s opened the door, wearing a bathrobe and looking confused. "Yes," she asked, squinting at me. "I have your sushi delivery," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew something was wrong. "I didn't order any sushi," she said, frowning. "I was just about to go to bed." My stomach dropped. I apologized and turned to leave, my mind racing. Halfway to my car, I looked up and froze. The same dark sedan from before was parked behind my car, blocking the driveway. Its engine was running, visible puffs of exhaust rising in the rain. Before I could process what was happening, 4 car doors opened simultaneously. 4 men got out, all wearing dark hoodies and face masks. One of them had his hand in his pocket, gripping something I couldn't see. My heart started pounding. They started moving toward me quickly. Without thinking, I dropped the delivery bag and ran. Not toward the house, I didn't want to endanger the woman, but toward the trees beside the driveway. I could hear footsteps behind me, splashing through puddles and someone shouting. I ran through the pine trees, branches whipping at my face, my shoes slipping on wet pine needles. I could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind me. The rain was coming down harder now, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I broke through the trees onto another property, where I finally saw lights and people. I called 911 from a neighbor's house. By the time the police arrived, the men in both cars were gone. They never found my car. Later, the police told me there had been similar incidents in neighboring towns' criminals using fake food delivery orders to target drivers. They suspected the group was behind the recent string of robberies too. I quit my delivery job the next day. Sometimes I still think about what might have happened if I hadn't run, or if I had run toward the house instead of the trees. These days, I only do deliveries during daytime hours and only in busy areas. But every time I see a dark sedan in my rearview mirror, I can't help but check to see if it's following me. I was driving back from a late-night photo shoot in the mountains. My client lived in this beautiful but remote cabin, perfect for the moody autumn portfolio we were working on. It was around 2 a.m, and a light drizzle had started to fall, making the winding mountain roads even more treacherous than usual. I probably should have accepted his offer to stay overnight, but I had an early morning wedding shoot the next day that I couldn't reschedule. The serpentine road stretched ahead of me, my headlights cutting through the misty darkness, while the rhythmic sound of my wipers kept me company. About 20 minutes into my drive, my headlights illuminated something unusual in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, perhaps a bit too hard, causing my camera equipment to shift in the back seat. There, standing upright in the center of my lane, was a large hiking backpack. It was one of those expensive ones that serious mountaineers use, just standing there as if someone had carefully placed it. The sight was deeply unsettling. I stayed in my car for a moment, engine running, considering my options. The pack was blocking my lane, and on these narrow mountain roads, going around it meant taking a blind curve on the wrong side. I remembered reading something in the local news about missing hikers in these mountains over the past few months. Something about this didn't feel right. I decided to carefully maneuver around it. As I passed, my headlights swept across the guardrail, and I could see the steep drop-off beyond it. The rain was getting heavier now. Just 5 minutes later, I came across another obstacle. A white van was parked in the middle of the road, hazard lights blinking in the rain. The orange lights created an eerie strobe effect in the mist. I stopped a safe distance behind it and honked twice. No response. Slowly, I began to edge around the van. As I pulled alongside, I noticed there was no one in the driver's seat. The van looked well-maintained, unlike an abandoned vehicle. Through the passenger window, I could see camping equipment neatly arranged in the back. After passing the van, I glanced in my rearview mirror and noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a small car, almost completely hidden in the shadows of the trees off the road. If I hadn't been looking carefully, I would have missed it entirely. I'd only driven another minute when my headlights caught a figure standing in the road. He was wearing an expensive-looking rain jacket and holding an umbrella. He smiled and held up his hand, gesturing for me to stop. Despite the rain and the late hour, he looked perfectly put together. Too put together for someone who'd supposedly broken down on a mountain road. He approached my car, still smiling. "Excuse me," he called out through the rain. "Did you pass a white van back there?" "It's mine." I ran out of fuel and had to walk to find help. His story made no sense. Why would he walk further up the mountain instead of down toward the nearest town? As he spoke, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. There was someone else, trying to stay hidden in the trees beside the road. The man was still talking, but my eyes were fixed on a metallic glint among the trees, probably from a weapon. Without hesitation, I rolled up my window and floored the accelerator. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man's pleasant expression transform into something terrifying. He screamed and slammed his fists against my back window as I sped away. I called the police as soon as I had cell service again. When they investigated, the van was gone, but they found the car I'd spotted. Inside, they discovered evidence linking it to 3 hikers who had disappeared in these mountains over the past 2 months. The man I encountered was never caught, but the missing hikers' backpacks were found hidden in a nearby cave, including the one I'd seen in the road. They believe he'd been using the backpack and van to force people to stop, probably counting on the natural instinct of hikers to help their own. I was lucky I decided to keep driving that night. Sometimes I still think about what might have happened if I'd gotten out of my car to move that backpack. I'd been working delivery jobs since I was 20, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. The order came in around 9:30, a simple delivery to what was supposed to be just another house. I'd been doing this long enough to know every street and shortcut in our town, but this address was different. The directions took me down Old Mill Road, a narrow stretch of pavement that wound through what used to be a thriving mining community. Most people had moved away decades ago when the mines closed, leaving behind scattered houses and overgrown yards. The few residents who stayed were mostly elderly folks who'd lived there their whole lives. The late September air was unusually cold as I drove deeper into the forgotten neighborhood. Bare tree branches created twisted patterns against the starlit sky, and the only sound was my tires crunching over fallen leaves. After about 15 minutes of driving, my GPS suddenly announced I had arrived at my destination. I pulled over, confused. The screen showed I was exactly where I needed to be, but all I could see were the remnants of old stone walls and chimneys poking through thick vegetation, the ruins of the original mining settlement. No houses, no lights, no signs of life at all. Frustrated, I pulled out my phone to call the customer. As it rang, something caught my eye, a pale blue light flickering between the trees, deep in the ruins. It glowed for just a moment before disappearing, like someone waving a lantern. "Hello," a man's voice answered, sounding distant and oddly hollow. I explained I was having trouble finding the address. He chuckled, a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Oh, you're in the right place. There's an old path near the stone wall. Just follow it in." I stepped out of my car, the cold air biting at my face. My flashlight beam revealed what he was talking about, a narrow dirt path, barely visible among the dead leaves and undergrowth. It looked more like a deer trail than anything meant for humans. As I stood there debating what to do, the blue light appeared again, closer this way. Something about it seemed wrong. It didn't move like a flashlight or lantern. It seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "I can see you're here," the voice came through my phone, though I hadn't heard it ring. "Just follow the path." We're waiting. Those words sent ice through my veins. I set the food bag on the ground next to my car, my instincts screaming at me to leave. As I reached for my car door, I heard it, the sound of multiple footsteps crunching through leaves, coming from different directions in the darkness. I jumped into my car and slammed the door just as the blue light appeared again, this time right at the edge of the trees. In its glow, I caught a glimpse of something that made me forget how to breathe. Multiple shadows moving between the ruins, all heading toward my car. I threw the car into drive and sped away, gravel spraying behind me. In my rearview mirror, I saw the blue light rise above the trees, brighter than before, illuminating several dark figures standing on the road where I'd just been. The police searched the area the next day, but found nothing except centuries-old ruins and my abandoned delivery bag. The phone number was disconnected, and the address didn't exist in any current records. The officer mentioned that there had been other reports over the years: strange lights, unexplained sounds, people going missing. I quit delivery work after that night. Sometimes when I drive past Old Mill Road, I see that blue light floating among the ruins. But now I know better than to stop, no matter who might be calling. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.